Hi, Laura. Great to see you. We've just been chatting a bit, but for just the viewers, I would love you to just explain a little bit about how you made that big transition from being a career woman in New York City to living very rurally and immersing yourself completely in nature and a beautiful, lovely little house in the country where you now live full time. We'd love to hear about that.
Well, this house was a weekend house. While my husband and I lived in Manhattan, we came up for the weekends. And I originally found this area because of my friend Scott Newkirk, who lived in the city but had come up here and created this incredible little off the grid cabin that wound up years later being on the cover of Cabin Porn. And he introduced me to this area, and I found a little place of my own. This was just before I met my husband, actually. So it was something not quite as remote and private as I might have gotten if I hadn't been a single woman at the time. But yeah, we came up here, and this was a weekend place for us for about 4 years before we made the full transition.
Right. Yeah. 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 I did the same thing. I got a house with where I could see the neighbors because I also bought something when I was by myself and then met my husband 3 years later. But it's still fine. I mean, it's not like I suddenly want no neighbors, but it's
Right.
definitely a different mindset and closer to town and all that. Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to let you get into your presentation and I'm going to switch myself off.
Thanks, Barbara. And hi, everybody else. I think the first thing I want to clarify for you is that I'm still a career woman. I was lucky enough to be able to bring my work from the city with me. I'm a freelance creative director. I have basically a consulting business where I work with brands on their messaging and identities. And that was something that I was able to continue when I moved up here full time. That was in 2009, and 15 years ago. So things weren't quite as remote friendly and zoomy as they are now. And I was originally going back to the city about once a week. But having lived in New York City for 20 years, making this full-time move up to the Catskills was really a big change. And it was one that my husband and I felt ready for, but also had given ourselves an out. We'd said, hey, we like it as a weekend place, but if it doesn't turn out that this is somewhere we want to live forever, we'll just turn around and go back to the city. And we never even discussed that ever again. It never happened, and I'm never going back. I do still visit occasionally, but I have a very different perception of the city. I know the city has changed. I know that I have changed. And you may be wondering, how can I possibly make a move out of the city? How can I leave? How can I go upstate? Um, and all I can say is, you need to try to envision the life that you want. And if that means leaving the city, I think you'll find a way to do it. I grew up in Northern California, under the redwoods. And so I had a relationship with nature already, but it was really asleep in so many ways. When you live a very urban existence, you're surrounded by people, so many people, and so many buildings, and so much noise. And for many years, I found that very exciting and stimulating. But when I was ready to leave, I was ready. And being upstate engendered a profound change in me. I I understood suddenly what it was to feel very connected to the earth. I don't really know what other way to say it. I began going outside so much more because that's what there was. Look, when I first moved up here in 2009, this area had not gone through the kind of renaissance that it's going through now, and that it really has been for about the last 5 years or so. I mean, there was very little here. There were hardly any restaurants, certainly no cute cafe where you could get a matcha latte, very few shops. We even did most of our grocery shopping in the city still because there were no farmers markets throughout the winter. Um, and so, and there were, not that many friends for us either. At first, we had to really find our kindred spirits up here. And there were definitely expats, refugees from the city, artists, makers, and to some extent, some entrepreneurs, not like now. But so initially, it was a lot about going outside and exploring. And I'm lucky enough to live across the way from a big, beautiful property that has an incredible marsh and a forest and a couple of different ecosystems to explore. And so, in a way, it was initially about getting exercise. I'm embarrassed to say that, but I needed to move my body, and so I went out and it was incredible. I reconnected to the feeling that I'd had as a child of being in the forest and the kind of secret magic that that gives you. And we put bird feeders up, and I got to know the birds here, and we started a garden, and I started to understand what plants would thrive and what the local plants were here a little bit. But what really cracked the world open for me, the outer world, was my desire to find wild mushrooms because I'm a cook. And I was like, I've heard there's some delicious wild mushrooms out here. How can I find them? And so I got a field guide, and I got out there and I started looking. And I was also looking for ramps, which are the wild leeks you may have heard about in this area. And I looked literally for years. But something happened. I came to the forest with a different pair of eyes. I wasn't just suffering from the same kind of plant blindness that most of us do now, that kind of blurring of everything into a generic sea of green that we bring with us from the city. And in getting to know each of the plant species and each of the tree species, because in order to find wild mushrooms, you have to understand where they grow. A lot of them have relationships with specific trees. So I started learning, that's an oak tree, that's a hemlock, that's a pine, that's a spruce, that's a ironwood, that's a maple. What mushrooms like which trees and what season are they in? What kind of microclimates do they like? Mushrooms like moss. Moss likes water. All of these bits of knowledge started to add up. And when I found my first hen of the woods, my first Grifola frondosa, or maitake as the Japanese call it, this incredible, ruffled, beautiful mushroom that fruits in the fall at the base of oak trees, my husband said he'd never seen me happier. And in fact, maitake means the dancing mushroom in Japanese. And I did a dance, literally. I was over the moon, and it was a slippery slope from there because I realized that the forest and the riparian landscape that we have here is so rich in wild edibles. And I was really hooked, and it started to make me feel differently about the place that I lived. I connected to it in a much deeper way. I observed the seasons in a different way. I came to understand these incredible micro seasons. And my home changed because I was constantly bringing in these beautiful ephemeral and not so ephemeral things that I found out there, whether it was like an incredible lichen from a tree, or a cross section of a black walnut, which was so beautiful, or I have a couple things here I pulled for you from my shelves. This is a vireo nest. They always build them in the little V of a branch like that. So beautiful. I have lots of nests in my home. Um, I have this prized possession, which is the skull of a barred owl that was hit by a car in front of my house. So I learned a lot of different skills. I learned how to preserve bones. I learned how to dismember birds. If I found dead birds, it's actually not legal. So I should just say a caveat. You're not supposed to touch any dead songbirds, but sometimes for the purposes of science and investigation, I do. Um, And I developed a lot of other practices that served me in ways both practical, culinary, and indeed spiritual. One of the things that I noticed after moving upstate was how much roadkill there was. Actually, my friend Scott and I had always fantasized about doing a project where we would keep a ladder in our car and take it out whenever we saw a deer hit and document the deer from above. We never did it, but it made me very aware of all the dead animals. And a certain time came when I just couldn't keep driving by them anymore. I just felt too connected to them. I'd seen them alive and in their environments, and I understood their roles in the ecosystem, and they were they were kindred spirits to me. So I began a practice of picking up the roadkill. Had to make some deals with my husband about it because he really didn't like the idea of me stopping in the road to do that, just for safety reasons, I guess. But I always keep a pair of gloves in the car. I agreed not to keep a shovel, so I only stop for animals that are relatively intact. Um, and I only do it in areas where I'm not putting my own life in jeopardy, obviously, but there's plenty of times when I can move a baby raccoon or a turkey or many gray squirrels from the road and give them a safer resting place, a place where other animals, carrion eaters, don't run the risk of being hit. I heard just recently that an eagle had been struck and killed because it was trying to get a deer off the road and a car had hit it. So all of these acts have repercussions, but in a way that really feeds me and makes me feel like I'm living in some kind of reciprocity with this land that has given me so much. And all of this incremental knowledge that I began building and this deeper connection that I was cultivating led me in 2017, so about 8 years after I've been living up here, to found an organization called the Outside Institute. And that started basically because I just felt like there were so many people that I encountered who wanted to be out in nature, but who didn't know where to go, or who were a little afraid of getting lost, or of animals, or who got out there but didn't know what they were seeing when they were out there. And it seemed like there was a real need. Not that I felt like I had all the knowledge, certainly not. I'm a creative director, born in California, lived in Manhattan. I'm not a PhD. I never studied herbalism or botany. I'm entirely self taught, other than a couple of wonderful mentors that I've been able to find. But I knew what I knew, and that's what I could share. And so I began leading guided walks in this area. And my mission is to help people connect to the healing and transformative powers of nature. That was my mission statement in 2017, and it remains the same. And basically, I do that by teaching people about the land that they inhabit. And I'll say just now that this land is originally Lenape land. Um, and the Lenape Indians, or the Lenape indigenous peoples, were the first peoples here, and this remains their land. And so much of the knowledge that we have, so much of the knowledge that I carry, is based on their deep wisdom, their connection to the land, their understanding of plants and animals and seasons and cycles and plant medicine. So it's an honor and a privilege to try to continue this long tradition of living in harmony and in reciprocity with the land that they have given us. Um, in addition to the guided walks, where I teach basically about whatever it is that we encounter, be it a nest, some moss, amazing trees, um, evidence of insects or animals, ecosystems. I also have co-written with Jillian Rappaport, my colleague, 3 field guides to the Northeast, where we created basically entry level, I would say, field guides, but also that offer something to even a more advanced naturalist. There's tons of field guides out there, but the reason that we felt compelled to create our own is because so many of the field guides don't tell you whether or not something is edible. And they don't talk about folklore that exists or traditional knowledge or craft or culinary knowledge. So we included all of that in our field guides. So we offer the walks, we create these field guides. I have a sort of side specialty in what I call botanical mixology, where I develop products to use in drinks and syrups and bitters and tinctures and tonics that are made from local plants. I really like to try and use the quote unquote invasive species, the non native introduced species that can tend to overpopulate certain ecosystems. So, like Japanese knotweed, um, mugwort, things like that, I will use in my potions and tonics, alcoholic and non alcoholic. I also am really happy to be able to collaborate in this work with the community that I tapped into up here. And that's what happens gradually when you're offering something to the community, you connect to other people who also have something to offer. And so we will offer workshops in natural dyes with experts in that. Um, I have a colleague that does incredible stitch work and embroidery that's inspired by plants, medicinal properties of plants, and folklore around plants. And I have a dear friend of Betty Blau, who is an artist, visual artist, and photographer. And she and I have collaborated on some workshops where we take people out to do a bit of a forage for plant matter that inspires them visually. And I teach them a little bit about whatever properties they might be drawn to. It's often seed pods or leaves, flowers in season, and then we do, Betty brings them back and we do flat lays and they document those. People find that to be really compelling. And, it's one thing to go out in nature and collect a bunch of pods and twigs and leaves, and that's wonderful. And you can appreciate them from an aesthetic viewpoint. But when you're able to get that other layer of knowledge around something, um, the tree that it came from and what that means, what that contributes, its name, because it's wonderful to have a way to refer to something that we share in common with other people. I don't care if it's the Latin name, just some way that we can refer to something in a shared way is very treasured. And, I feel like getting a little bit deeper in love with these elements that draw us in by their color or their shape or their fragrance, knowing a little bit more about them, giving them a little bit more respect. People are often asking me, what good is that? How can I use that? What's that useful for? And sometimes I just stop and say, it is what it is. Beyond just being beautiful, do you need it to be anything else? And I think that that's a perspective that we can take into the world in a lot of different ways. And my work in the outside world has given me so much perspective and a kind of wisdom, I'll even say, um, about life because it contains so many metaphors for it. Of course, that's not its job. The earth's job is not to be a metaphor for us, but we can draw from it. And so much poetry and literature does, and there's a reason for that. If you really start to observe closely the beauty of the natural world, and I will just say, there is no dichotomy between a civilized world and a natural world. There's just the one world, so it's all the natural world. So if you bring all of your honed powers of observation to bear on the natural world, I think you'll come to understand so much more about your purpose, that your purpose is simply to be, to exist in harmony, and that everything else is just gravy. So, in closing, I will say that it's been my greatest joy and my life's work to connect to the nature that's outside here. And moving upriver has been a transformative experience for me. And that if you're envisioning a way to do that, um, you should continue down that path. And until then, don't hesitate to bring the beautiful elements of the outside world into your home. As Barbara has shown so wonderfully in her book, everybody that lives up here transforms their living space in accordance with what's going on outside, because that's really the driving force for all of us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Laura. That was beautiful and, as always, super inspiring. I just want you to tell a little bit, or just quickly, about your actual store that you have in Callicoon, because
Yeah,
we can
I
come and
forgot
see
about
you
that.
there.
Yes, in fact, last year at around this time, we opened an outpost of the Outside Institute. It's in Callicoon, New York, on Lower Main Street, and it's an opportunity for us to hold workshops there, indoors, and we also have a little retail section where I curate all the things I love as a naturalist, including books, field guides, some jewelry, natural cosmetics, herbal medicine, some clothing, whatever strikes my natural fancy, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a wonderful store, and I urge everyone to go and see it if you are going upstate. And of course, Laura's house is in the book. And Betty, who she mentioned, her house is also in the book. And I joined the two of them on one of their afternoons with a bunch of other women, and photographed the projects that they do together. So if you get the book, you can see how that works and how that looks and how it evolves and how inspiring it all is. And Laura, I want to thank you again for being here. And you were with us last time, and always inspiring. And I hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much.